just for control of goods, but for the soul of two civilizations, pitting imperial might against imperial pride. But how did such a seemingly distant conflict begin? And what forces set the stage for one of the most infamous wars in history? Welcome to ASMR History, a place where I invite you to journey through time, not with the thunderous charge of armies, but through the gentle flow of words. Here, history is told softly, with a voice that soothes while it informs. If you're new to the channel, expect to find relaxing yet deeply insightful explorations of key moments in history, from ancient empires to modern revolutions. Our goal is to unravel the past and weave it into narratives that bring you both relaxation and knowledge. And in today's video, I'll be diving into the origins of the Opium Wars, two brutal conflicts that forever altered the balance of power in the East and West. As we embark on this journey together, it's important to understand that the Opium Wars were not isolated events. They were the culmination of decades of tension, greed, and misunderstanding between Britain's rising empire and China's Qing dynasty. The First Opium War, which broke out in 1839, was sparked by Britain's growing appetite for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, commodities that were highly coveted in the West. But China, on the other hand, had little interest in British goods. This trade imbalance led to Britain exploiting the one product it knew China couldn't resist: opium. What began as trade quickly spiraled into a conflict that would leave a deep scar on Chinese society. The Second Opium War, beginning in 1856, was merely a continuation of unresolved tensions. After the first conflict, Britain's ambitions had not been fully satisfied, and China's internal struggles left it vulnerable to further Western intervention. This time, more powers would enter the fray, deepening the wounds and driving China further into a state of unrest. Both wars would have long-lasting impacts on China's sovereignty, Britain's global dominance, and the geopolitical landscape of the 19th century. In this video, we'll explore the key players in these wars: Britain, the insatiable empire hungry for control, and China, the proud dynasty struggling to maintain its autonomy. We'll also dive into the broader themes of economic exploitation, cultural clashes, and the devastating rise of opium as a tool for imperialism. But first, to truly grasp the gravity of these conflicts, we must journey back to a time before the wars, a time when China was still the Middle Kingdom, ruling over a vast and prosperous land. The Qing dynasty, once a symbol of strength and grandeur, had a fascinating rise to power. In 1644, the Manchus swept down from the north, toppling the Ming dynasty and establishing themselves as the new rulers of China. Their reign would stretch over centuries, marked by territorial conquests, cultural flourishes, and moments of immense power. By the 18th century, the Qing dynasty had reached its apex, commanding vast swaths of land that stretched from the shores of the East China Sea to the deserts of Central Asia. China under the Qing was not just a kingdom, it was an empire, a force that seemed, from the outside, untouchable. But even as the empire expanded its borders and consolidated its wealth, cracks had already begun to form beneath the surface. Politically, the Qing rulers became increasingly disconnected from the people they governed. The vast bureaucracy that ran the empire had grown bloated with corruption, particularly in the far-flung provinces where local officials exploited their positions for personal gain. Taxes were mismanaged and public projects languished. The emperor, isolated within the Forbidden City, could do little to rein in the inefficiencies that plagued his government. The divide between the central power and the provinces widened, with regional corruption making the empire vulnerable from within. Socially, unrest simmered. The population, growing rapidly, became restless under the weight of high taxes and government neglect. The White Lotus Rebellion, 1794 to 1804, was just one manifestation of the widespread discontent that bubbled up across the country. This uprising, driven by religious sects and impoverished farmers, shook the foundations of Qing rule, signalling that beneath the surface of imperial strength lay a growing fragility. It was a warning that China was not as stable as it appeared. As the historian Jonathan Spence noted, the Qing dynasty had reached its zenith in terms of territorial control, yet its internal stability was already waning due to bureaucratic inefficiency and social unrest. Despite these growing problems, the Qing dynasty held tightly to its traditions, particularly in matters of foreign relations. China viewed itself as the Middle Kingdom, the centre of the world, and saw little need for external influences. This attitude shaped its trade policies, most notably through the Canton system. Foreign merchants, particularly those from Europe, were restricted to the southern port of Canton, modern-day Guangzhou. Trade was tightly regulated, and foreigners had to adhere to China's strict rules, which were designed to ensure that foreign influence remained at bay. The emperor saw China as self-sufficient, with no need for foreign goods, except for silver, which was one of the few items the Chinese truly valued from the West. The Canton system was not just about trade. It was a reflection of China's broader tribute system, in which foreign nations were expected to pay homage to the emperor. In the eyes of the Qing, European powers like Britain were just another tributary state. Their merchants allowed access to China's wealth as long as they respected the empire's superiority. This attitude was made crystal clear in a letter sent by Emperor Qianlong to Britain's King George III in 1793. The British, eager to expand their trade opportunities, had sent an envoy to China seeking more open relations. But Qianlong's response was swift and unequivocal. The Celestial Empire holds itself in awe of nothing under heaven. In other words, China had no need for Britain's goods or friendship. This isolationist mindset was rooted in the belief that China, with its vast internal economy, had everything it needed. Agriculture thrived, artisans produced fine goods, and the imperial coffers overflowed with wealth from the countryside. But this self-sufficiency also made the empire blind to the changes happening in the outside world. As Europe underwent an industrial revolution and expanded its global influence, China remained insular, confident in its position as the world's preeminent power. It was a dangerous complacency, one that would soon be shattered. By the early 19th century, the tides of trade were shifting, and with them came a problem that would soon grip the Qing dynasty in its vice, opium. Britain, frustrated by China's refusal to open more ports to trade, found a commodity that could bridge the trade imbalance: Indian-grown opium. Initially, the Chinese government took little notice of the drug, but as its use spread, officials began to sound the alarm. Opium was not just a luxury product, it was becoming a social and economic plague. For the Chinese, opium represented more than just a health crisis. It was a direct assault on their cultural values. Confucian teachings, which formed the moral bedrock of Chinese society, emphasized discipline, moderation, and the importance of maintaining social harmony. The widespread use of opium, which led to addiction and social decay, was seen as a moral failing, a sign that society was straying from its proper course. The Qing government, recognizing the destructive power of the drug, attempted to clamp down on its spread. Local officials began to enforce bans, and harsh punishments were imposed on those caught trading or using opium. But these efforts were in vain. The demand for opium grew, and with it, a vast underground network of traders emerged. Smugglers, many of them foreign, found ways to circumvent the bans, funneling opium into China's cities and countryside. The Qing government, already weakened by internal corruption and unrest, struggled to contain the growing crisis. By the time the government fully recognized the scale of the problem, it was too late. The opium trade had become a force too powerful to stop with laws and edicts. This clash between a proud, isolated empire and a globalizing world would soon lead to conflict on an unprecedented scale. China's attempts to resist the encroaching influence of the West, coupled with its growing internal instability, set the stage for the Opium Wars. The Qing dynasty, once seemingly invincible, would soon find itself at the mercy of foreign powers, whose ambitions stretched far beyond simple trade. But to understand how China became ensnared in this web of opium and imperial ambition, we must first turn our gaze to the other side of the conflict. The British Empire. A nation driven by commerce and conquest, Britain saw the opium trade as a means to expand its influence and wealth. It is here, in the heart of Britain's growing empire, that the seeds of the Opium Wars were sown. The British Empire, by the early 19th century, was a global power like no other. Its navy ruled the seas, its colonies stretched across continents, and its economic reach was unmatched. But even as Britain basked in the glory of empire, it faced a problem that threatened its expanding dominance: China. The vast Qing dynasty held treasures that Europe, and particularly Britain, craved: tea, silk, porcelain, and more. These luxuries became so desirable in the West, the demand for them skyrocketed, and with it, a trade imbalance that threatened to bankrupt Britain. British merchants were pouring silver into China to pay for these coveted goods, but the Chinese, secure in their wealth and self-sufficiency, had little interest in British exports. The result? A massive trade deficit that drained Britain's silver reserves and posed a serious threat to its global economic ambitions. It was a crisis, but Britain, ever resourceful in matters of trade, found its solution in a substance that would soon darken the pages of history: opium. Grown in India under British colonial control, opium became the silver bullet that Britain needed to balance its trade with China. Instead of paying for Chinese goods with precious silver, Britain would funnel opium into China, creating a demand for a product that would turn the tables of trade in their favour. At its heart, this decision was driven by cold economic strategy. The British government, and more specifically the East India Company, recognised that opium was a commodity too valuable to ignore. As Julia Lovell aptly put it, the British Empire was built on trade, and the commodity of opium harvested in India became the key to unlocking the Chinese market. By flooding China with opium, Britain could finally control the flow of silver, ensuring that wealth flowed back into its hands rather than into Chinese vaults. It was a plan as lucrative as it was devastating. However, this wasn't just a matter of balancing the books. It was also deeply rooted in Britain's imperial ideology. The British believed in the righteousness of their empire, a conviction that extended to their vision of global trade. Free trade, as they saw it, was not just an economic principle, but a moral one. The idea that markets should be open and goods should flow freely was central to Britain's imperial mission. If China resisted British goods, Britain would force the issue by any means necessary, even if that meant using a drug that would cripple a society. To British officials, the opium trade wasn't exploitation. It was a natural and necessary extension of their right to trade wherever and however they pleased. At the heart of this operation was the East India Company, an entity that had grown from a group of private merchants into one of the most powerful institutions in the British Empire. Founded in 1600, the East India Company began as a trading enterprise, but by the 19th century it had become the de facto ruler of large parts of India, controlling vast resources and commanding its own private army. It was through the East India Company that Britain's opium strategy was put into action. The company held a monopoly over opium production in India, particularly in the fertile plains of Bengal, where poppy fields stretched for miles. From these fields, opium was harvested and processed, ready to be shipped across the seas. The East India Company operated with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that opium reached Chinese shores, despite Qing laws banning the drug. Private traders, many of them British, took up the task of smuggling the opium into China, using intricate networks to evade Chinese authorities. These smuggling operations were a logistical feat in themselves. Opium was transported by ship from India to China's southern coast, where it was unloaded in secret ports or transferred to smaller vessels that could navigate China's rivers. Corruption was rife, and many Chinese officials were more than willing to turn a blind eye to the illegal trade in exchange for a share of the profits. As the opium trade grew, so did the underground markets that sustained it, spreading the drug deeper into Chinese society. The impact of this trade was catastrophic. once limited to the upper classes, opium use spread rapidly through all levels of society. Farmers, labourers, and merchants alike became ensnared in the drug's grip, and addiction began to hollow out China's social fabric. Families were torn apart as addicts neglected their duties and squandered their wealth to feed their habits. The workforce weakened, productivity declined, and criminal activity surged as desperation took hold. Opium dens became a common sight in China's cities, their smoky interiors filled with men lost in a haze of addiction. These dens weren't just places of vice, they were symbols of a society in decay. As more and more Chinese citizens fell victim to the drug, opium began to represent something far more sinister than just a trade imbalance. It was seen as a foreign poison, corrupting the body of the empire from within. Traditional Confucian values, which emphasized discipline, family loyalty, and social harmony, were under siege, and many Chinese elites viewed the spread of opium as a moral catastrophe. The Qing government, alarmed by the scale of the problem, made several attempts to stop the trade, but the corruption that had infected the empire's bureaucracy made it difficult to enforce the anti-opium laws. Smugglers operated with impunity, and local officials often profited from the very trade they were supposed to stop. It was a vicious cycle, one that the Qing emperor knew had to be broken if China was to survive. In 1839, the Qing court made a bold move. The emperor appointed Lin Zexu, a respected official known for his integrity, as imperial commissioner with the task of eradicating the opium trade once and for all. Lin took his job seriously. He cracked down on opium smugglers, destroyed vast quantities of the drug, and even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her sense of justice and urging her to stop the trade. But Britain, driven by its imperial ambitions and economic interests, was not about to give up its most profitable market. For the British, the opium trade was justified by their belief in free trade. The British government argued that China had no right to restrict the flow of goods, including opium, and that doing so violated the principles of global commerce. This ideological stance was bolstered by the enormous profits that the opium trade generated, profits that funded British expansion in Asia and allowed Britain to maintain its position as a global power. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the growing tensions between Britain and China failed, as both sides dug in their heels. The British, determined to protect their merchants and their opium trade, began to prepare for war. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only devastate China, but also reshape the course of history in Asia. And so, with tensions rising and diplomacy faltering, the drums of war began to beat. The Opium Wars, as they would come to be known, were not just about trade. They were about the clash of empires, ideologies, and the future of a nation on the brink. But before the first shots were fired, we must look at the events that led up to the conflict, and how a diplomatic failure spiraled into a war that would forever change the balance of power between East and West. By 1839, the situation in China had reached a boiling point. Opium addiction was rampant, social decay was spreading, and the once and for all. Lin Zexu wasn't just an official. He was a man on a mission, driven by both moral outrage and national pride. He believed that the opium trade was not just a criminal act, but a moral and existential threat to the empire. The nation was crumbling under the weight of addiction, and Lin was determined to root out the source of the poison. Lin's campaign against opium was swift and uncompromising. He cracked down on local merchants, arrested those involved in the trade, and publicly destroyed opium paraphernalia to send a message that this menace would no longer be tolerated. His most dramatic act came in June of 1839, when he ordered the confiscation and destruction of more than 20,000 chests of British opium at Human. This was no quiet affair. It was a bold, symbolic gesture meant to demonstrate China's resolve in the face of British economic aggression. In brine-filled trenches, the opium was broken open, washed away, and burned, an unmistakable declaration that China would not bend to the will of foreign powers. As the fumes of burning opium filled the air, tensions between Britain and China reached a breaking point. The British, outraged at the destruction of their valuable goods, viewed Lin Zexu's actions as a direct attack on their economic interests. This wasn't just about lost profits, it was a matter of imperial pride. The destruction at Human ignited a diplomatic crisis that would soon spiral into full-scale war, but Lin Zexu didn't stop there. He penned a letter to Queen Victoria, urging her to put an end to the opium trade. In his famous appeal, he framed the issue not as one of trade, but of morality. Let those barbarians be warned, lest they continue to poison our people, he wrote, imploring the British monarch to consider the ethical ramifications of flooding China with such a deadly substance. However, his words fell on deaf ears. The British government did not respond, and the wheels of war began to turn. The first sparks of conflict ignited in the waters near Kowloon, where British naval forces clashed with Chinese troops in September 1839. The battle was brief but significant. It marked the moment when diplomatic tensions turned into outright hostilities. Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade in China, led the British forces, determined to protect British interests and assert naval dominance. The conflict escalated rapidly as British forces, using their superior technology and firepower, began to overwhelm the Chinese military. The Battle of Kowloon was just the beginning. Britain's naval superiority was indisputable. At the heart of their campaign was the ironclad Nemesis, a steam-powered gunboat capable of navigating the shallow rivers and coastlines of China with ease. The Chinese fleet, composed mostly of wooden junks, stood little chance against this modern war machine. Time and again, British ships decimated Chinese defences, particularly in the southern waters near Canton. In 1841, the British captured key fortresses along the Pearl River, such as Chwenpi and the Bogue, in a series of naval engagements that left China's coastal defences in ruins. British gunboats rained fire on Chinese positions, overwhelming them with sheer firepower and precision. The imbalance in military technology was stark. China's British set their sights on Canton, one of China's most important trade hubs. Canton had long been the epicenter of foreign trade in China, and its capture would be a devastating blow to the Qing dynasty. Led by General Hugh Gough, British forces launched an invasion of the city in March 1841. After heavy fighting, they succeeded in capturing Canton, solidifying Britain's dominance in the region and delivering a humiliating defeat to the Qing government. The fall of Canton was a pivotal moment in the war, not just because of its economic significance, but because it underscored the Qing's inability to defend its most vital cities from foreign invaders. In the wake of Canton's capture, Britain solidified its hold on southern China by occupying the island of Hong Kong in January 1841. This small, seemingly insignificant island would soon become one of Britain's most valuable colonial possessions. With its deep water port and strategic location, Hong Kong became a crucial base of operations for the British Navy during the war. It was a foothold that Britain would never relinquish, and its capture marked the beginning of over a century of British rule in the region. Hong Kong's fate was sealed, and its transformation into a global trade hub began. As British forces continued to dominate the southern coast, they expanded their campaign to other key ports along China's coastline, capturing cities like Ningbo, Amoy, and Shanghai. The British, using their control of the seas, moved with ease from one victory to the next, exploiting China's weakened defences. However, resistance in the north continued. Chinese officials, though outmatched, refused to capitulate easily. The war dragged on, with the British expanding their influence and the Qing government struggling to maintain any semblance of control. The devastation to China's infrastructure was immense. Cities were left in ruins, and the Qing military was in disarray. With each British victory, the Qing government's hold over its territory weakened, and the emperor's authority crumbled. By 1842, after 3 years of conflict, the Qing dynasty had no choice but to sue for peace. British forces had pushed deep into China, threatening to march even further if the Qing continued to resist. Negotiations began, and by August 1842, the Treaty of Nanking was signed, officially ending the First Opium War. The terms of the treaty were humiliating for China. The Qing government was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, marking the beginning of British colonial rule that would last until 1997. More devastating, however, was the opening of 5 key ports: Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, to British merchants, effectively ending China's Canton system of restricted trade. These ports became gateways through which foreign powers could exert their influence, and China's sovereignty over its own markets began to erode. In addition to these territorial and economic concessions, China was also required to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars to cover the costs of the war and the destroyed opium. Perhaps most damaging of all was the introduction of extraterritoriality, which granted British citizens immunity from Chinese law, allowing them to operate with impunity within China's borders. The Qing dynasty, already weakened by internal strife and corruption, found itself at the mercy of foreign powers. The Treaty of Nanking marked the beginning of what would later be known as China's century of humiliation, a period during which foreign nations dominated China's economic and political life. The once proud empire was reduced to a shadow of its former self, its sovereignty eroded, and its people suffering under the weight of foreign exploitation. The opium trade, which had fueled the conflict, continued to thrive even after the war, worsening China's addiction crisis and deepening its social decay. For Britain, the war was a resounding success. It had secured new trade routes, expanded its empire, and solidified its dominance in East Asia. Other European powers and the United States quickly took note, seeking similar concessions from China and further entrenching foreign influence in the region. The Opium War had reshaped the balance of power in Asia, and Britain had emerged as the undisputed victor. But while the First Opium War had ended, the tensions between China and the West had not been fully resolved. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and just over a decade later, the world would witness the eruption of the Second Opium War, a conflict that would plunge China deeper into chaos and further entrench the foreign powers that sought to carve up its empire. In the uneasy years following the Treaty of Nanking, tensions between Britain and China never truly subsided. The First Opium War had left deep scars, but the treaty's terms had failed to address the underlying grievances. Britain, now with a foothold in Chinese markets, hungered for more access and control. Chinese officials, on the other hand, saw the continued Western presence as a threat to their sovereignty. The situation was a powder keg, waiting for a spark to ignite another round of conflict. That spark came in the form of the Arrow incident. In October 1856, Chinese authorities boarded the Arrow, a vessel registered under the British flag, but suspected of piracy and smuggling. They arrested several of the Chinese crew members, sparking immediate outrage from the British. Although the men were quickly released, the damage had been done. The British claimed that the act violated their treaty rights, despite the fact that the Arrow's registration had technically expired. For Britain, this incident was less about the ship itself and more about an opportunity to demand further concessions from the Qing dynasty. Commissioner Ye Mingchen, the Chinese official in charge of Canton, refused to apologize or back down, and tensions escalated. Britain, unwilling to let the matter slide, retaliated swiftly. British forces bombarded Canton, a clear signal that they would not tolerate what they saw as a slight against their imperial power. The Arrow incident was more than just a diplomatic spat. It was a reflection of the fragile and deteriorating relationship between China and the West. Britain's patience with Qing resistance had run thin, and this seemingly minor incident became the pretext for a much larger confrontation. The thin veneer of respect for Chinese sovereignty that had been maintained after the First Opium War was now stripped away, and the path to another war was clear. While Britain's grievances with China were numerous, they were not alone in their frustrations. France, too, had its own reasons to enter the fray. In 1856, a French missionary was murdered in Guangxi province, providing France setting the stage for a joint military campaign against China. The Anglo-French alliance proved formidable, coordinating their military and diplomatic strategies. The two nations moved swiftly to pressure the Qing dynasty. The combined strength of their naval fleets and armies overwhelmed the Qing forces, who were already struggling to contain internal unrest and had little capacity to resist a coordinated Western assault. While Britain and France launched their campaigns, the United States and Russia, though not directly involved in the fighting, sent diplomats to negotiate their own favourable treaties, seeking to capitalise on China's weakened position. In late 1857, the Anglo-French forces set their sights on Canton once more. The city had been a key battleground in the First Opium War, and now it became the target of a joint assault by the Western powers. With superior naval artillery and ground forces, the British and French easily overwhelmed Canton's defences. After intense fighting, the city fell in December 1857. Qing official Yan Mingchen, who had defied British demands during the Arrow incident, was captured and later exiled. The fall of Canton marked a significant victory for the Anglo-French alliance, further destabilising southern China and undermining the Qing government's ability to protect its territory. As British and French forces pressed further into China, the war took a brutal turn. In 1860, as the conflict neared its climax, the Anglo-French forces marched on Beijing. Their goal was to force the Qing court into submission and secure the concessions they had long sought. However, the negotiations broke down and Western prisoners were captured, tortured, and executed by Qing forces. In retaliation, the British and French decided to strike a devastating blow against the heart of Chinese cultural pride. The Old Summer Palace, or Yuanmingyuan. The Old Summer Palace was an architectural marvel, renowned for its vast gardens, palaces, and cultural treasures. It was a symbol of imperial power and prestige, a place where emperors had ruled for generations. But in October 1860, under orders from Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, the palace was looted and set ablaze. The destruction of Yuanmingyuan was not just a military tactic, it was a deliberate act of cultural desecration, meant to punish the Qing court and send a clear message about the consequences of defying Western demands. The loss of the Old Summer Palace was a catastrophic blow to the Qing dynasty, both symbolically and politically. It was more than just a palace, it was a representation of China's imperial majesty, and its destruction struck at the heart of Chinese national pride. For the Chinese people, the looting and burning of Yuanmingyuan became a lasting symbol of the humiliation inflicted upon their nation by Western powers. With Beijing under threat and the Qing government in disarray, the war drew to a close. In 1858, the Treaty of Tianjin was signed, marking the end of the first phase of the Second Opium War. However, it was far from a final resolution. The Qing government, reluctant to implement the treaty's harsh terms, delayed its enforcement, leading to renewed hostilities in 1859. The Treaty of Tianjin, like the Treaty of Nanking before it, forced China to open more of beyond the original 5 treaty ports. This time, however, the stakes were even higher. One of the most significant provisions of the Treaty of Tianjin was the formal legalization of the opium trade. For Britain, this was a major victory. No longer would the opium trade be conducted in the shadows. It was now a legitimate and legal enterprise, ensuring that the flow of opium into China would continue unchecked. The treaty also granted Western missionaries and traders the right to travel freely throughout China, further eroding the Qing dynasty's control over its own territory. The war dragged on, and in 1860, after another series of military campaigns, the Anglo-French forces captured Beijing, effectively bringing the conflict to an end. The Convention of Peking, signed in October 1860, cemented China's defeat. Under its terms, the Qing government was forced to ratify the Treaty of Tianjin and agree to even further concessions. The Kowloon Peninsula, adjacent to Hong Kong, was ceded to Britain, expanding British colonial holdings in the region. The opium trade was reaffirmed, and Western powers secured extraterritorial rights, granting their citizens immunity from Chinese law. As historian Emmanuel C.Y. Xu wrote, the treaties of 1858 and 1860 left China not only humiliated, but also subjected to an international legal order dictated by the West. The Second Opium War had devastated China, both physically and psychologically. The Qing dynasty, already weakened by internal strife and corruption, was now a shell of its former self. The loss of territory, the legalization of the opium trade, and the increasing presence of foreign merchants and missionaries all contributed to the erosion of Chinese sovereignty. The once great empire was now subjugated by Western powers, its future uncertain. For Britain and France, the Second Opium War was a resounding success. They had secured greater access to China's markets, expanded their influence in East Asia, and solidified their control over the lucrative opium trade. The economic and geopolitical benefits gained from the war helped fuel their imperial ambitions, not just in China, but throughout the region. For China, however, the consequences were dire. The legalization of the opium trade ensured that addiction would continue to plague Chinese society for decades to come. The social and economic disarray caused by widespread addiction further weakened the Qing government, which struggled to maintain order in the face of growing internal unrest. Rebellion simmered, and the seeds of future conflict were sown in the ashes of war. The Second Opium War, like the first, had left China humiliated and broken. Yet, this was only one chapter in the larger story of British imperialism. Opium had not only devastated China, but had become a key tool in Britain's global strategy of domination. To truly understand the full impact of these wars, we must now turn our attention to the role of opium in British imperialism, and how this one commodity became both a weapon and a symbol of empire. Opium was more than just a narcotic. For the British Empire, it was a commodity of immense strategic value, a linchpin of imperial commerce. By the early 19th century, as Britain's thirst for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain grew insatiable, the empire found itself with a silver flowed out of British coffers into China, and something had to be done to rebalance the scales. The solution came from the vast opium fields of India, grown in Bengal, harvested under British control, and shipped across the seas. Opium would become the substance that not only levelled the economic playing field, but also fueled Britain's broader imperial ambitions. The British East India Company held a strict monopoly over opium production in Bengal, one of the most fertile regions for the crop. British colonial officials organised its cultivation with ruthless efficiency. Local farmers, often coerced into growing opium instead of food crops, were bound to the company's demands. In exchange for meagre compensation, they toiled in the fields, their efforts fueling an industry that stretched far beyond India's borders. Through this monopoly, the East India Company ensured that it controlled not just production, but also the lucrative flow of opium into China. For Britain, the profits from opium weren't merely a windfall, they were essential. The revenue from the opium trade was used to finance British colonial rule in India, funding administrative costs and military operations. The British Empire, with its sprawling territories and constant need for expansion, relied heavily on these profits to maintain control over its colonies, particularly India. The suppression of Indian rebellions, the expansion into Southeast Asia, and even Britain's dominance in global trade all had ties to the revenue generated by the sale of opium. Opium was, in many ways, the financial backbone of British imperialism. The global opium trade also expanded beyond the borders of India and China, reaching into Southeast Asia and other parts of the empire. The profits from opium fueled Britain's broader imperial ventures, helping to finance its growing presence across the globe. As historian Karl Trocky noted, opium was not just a drug, it was a linchpin of British imperial commerce. It became a cornerstone of Britain's economic dominance in the East, a tool for both trade and conquest. But while opium may have been a key component of British economic strategy, its moral implications were harder to ignore. As the trade flourished, so did the voices of dissent back home in Britain. The opium trade, while highly profitable, sparked intense debate within the empire, raising questions about ethics, morality, and Britain's role on the world stage. One of the most vocal critics of the opium trade was William Gladstone, who would later serve as British Prime Minister. Even during the height of the opium trade, Gladstone denounced its moral failings. He argued that the trade exploited the Chinese people, fueling addiction for British profit. In a powerful speech before Parliament, Gladstone declared, "The iniquities of the opium trade are so glaring that it would seem impossible for them to be overlooked." For Gladstone, this was more than just a trade dispute. It was a moral outrage, one that tarnished Britain's reputation and went against the very principles of justice and fairness that the empire claimed to uphold. Gladstone was not alone in his opposition. Religious leaders and missionaries working in China and across the empire were among the most vocal critics of the opium trade. Many of these missionaries, such as James Legge and Hudson Taylor, witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of opium addiction on the Chinese population. They reported back to Britain with aggravated by the widespread use of the drug. For these missionaries, the opium trade was a sin, a direct violation of Christian values, and they lobbied fiercely for its abolition. Public outrage began to grow as these reports circulated in Britain. Missionaries and social reformers shone a spotlight on the moral contradictions of British imperial policy. The Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade, founded in 1874, became a leading voice in the campaign to end British involvement in the opium trade. While their influence in the mid-19th century was limited, their efforts marked the beginning of a broader movement that would eventually push for reforms. For many Britons, the opium trade was a stain on the nation's conscience, an indefensible act of exploitation that stood in stark contrast to the ideals of civilization and progress that the empire claimed to represent. However, moral opposition often collided with economic interests, and more often than not, the latter triumphed. British merchants, East India Company officials, and even members of the government defended the opium trade as essential to maintaining the empire's profitability. The arguments were pragmatic. The trade kept the empire's coffers full, ensured Britain's dominance in East Asia, and balanced the growing demand for Chinese goods with the silver flowing out of Britain. In the face of such economic necessity, ethical concerns were frequently brushed aside. This clash between morality and profit played out in the halls of Parliament, on the streets of London, and in the tea houses of China. For every voice that spoke out against the opium trade, there were others who argued for its continuation, driven by the desire to protect Britain's economic interests and maintain its global standing. As the empire expanded, so did the contradictions inherent in its policies. Britain, the world's leading advocate of free trade and progress, found itself entangled in a web of exploitation and addiction, with opium at its centre. Opium, then, was more than just a drug or a commodity. It was a symbol of British imperialism, a reminder of the lengths to which the empire would go to maintain its dominance. While voices of dissent grew louder over time, the trade continued to flourish, fueling both Britain's economic ambitions and China's descent into social and economic disarray. Yet, for all the debates in Britain, the true cost of the opium trade was borne by the Chinese people. To fully understand the impact of the Opium Wars, we must now turn our attention to the Chinese perspective, to the voices within China who fought against this destructive trade, and the lasting scars it left on the empire. The Opium Wars wreaked havoc on Chinese society, leaving behind scars that would take generations to heal. By the mid-19th century, opium addiction had reached epidemic proportions, cutting across all levels of society, from rural peasants to urban elites, and even within the ranks of government officials. No one was immune. This wasn't just a drug problem, it was a national crisis. The debilitating effects of addiction weakened China's labour force and frayed the social fabric of the nation. In cities like Canton and Shanghai, opium dens became a common sight, their smoky interiors filled with addicts who had fallen prey to the narcotic. What began as an economic tool for Britain soon into a social catastrophe for China. By the 1850s, it was estimated that over 12 million Chinese were addicted to opium. This staggering number wasn't just a statistic, it represented the lives of workers, soldiers, and families who had become ensnared in the drug's grip. Productivity plummeted as addiction spread, and China's workforce, already strained by internal unrest and poverty, began to crumble. The widespread addiction had ripple effects on the economy, as opium drained both physical and financial resources. Silver reserves that once fueled the empire's economy were funneled into paying for more opium, deepening China's balance of payments crisis. Opium not only ravaged the nation's health and economy, but also undermined its military strength. The Qing military, already struggling with outdated technology and poor organisation, was further weakened by the prevalence of addiction among its ranks. Soldiers and officers alike fell victim to the drug, rendering them ineffective in defending China against foreign incursions. The empire's once vaunted military power was reduced to a shell of its former self, unable to stand against the technologically superior forces of Britain and France. This degradation of Chinese society occurred against a backdrop of broader social unrest. The country was in the throes of internal strife, with rebellion simmering and local governance teetering on the edge of collapse. The opium trade and the wars it triggered exacerbated these existing tensions. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850-1864, one of the deadliest civil wars in history, erupted during this period of turmoil. It was, in many ways, a direct response to the Qing government's perceived inability to protect China from foreign influence and internal decay. The devastating effects of the opium trade fueled disillusionment with the ruling dynasty, further weakening the already fragile Qing regime. China was not just facing a foreign enemy, it was being torn apart from within. In this storm of social, economic, and military decline, one man stood as a beacon of resistance. Lin Sexu, appointed by the Taoguang Emperor to lead China's efforts against the opium trade, Lin Sexu quickly became a national hero. His bold actions in 1839, particularly his decision to confiscate and destroy more than 20,000 chests of British opium at Human, directly sparked the First Opium War. But to the Chinese, Lin was more than just an official. He was a symbol of defiance against foreign exploitation and imperial aggression. Lin Sexu's efforts to eradicate opium from China were both moral and practical. He launched public campaigns to raise awareness of the drug's dangers, implemented strict legal measures to punish smugglers and addicts, and sought to rally the Chinese people against the growing threat. Though his actions ultimately led to war, they were driven by a deep sense of duty to protect China from the devastating effects of opium. Lin's moral stance, captured in his famous letter to Queen Victoria, framed the issue not just as an economic dispute, but as a matter of life and death for the Chinese people. Though Lin was dismissed and exiled following China's defeat in the First Opium War, his legacy endured. He became a symbol of Chinese resistance to Western imperialism, celebrated for his unwavering commitment to defending Chinese sovereignty commemorate his actions, and his name has been immortalized in Chinese literature and film. He remains one of the few Qing officials remembered for standing up to foreign aggression, a hero who embodies China's moral struggle against exploitation. But for all of Lin's efforts, the Qing government as a whole failed to rise to the challenge posed by the opium trade and the foreign powers that sought to dominate China. The Opium Wars exposed the deep weaknesses in the Qing dynasty's military and political systems. While Britain and France deployed modern weapons and steam-powered ships, the Qing military was stuck in the past, relying on outdated weapons, poorly trained soldiers, and an inadequate navy. The technological gap between China and the West was stark, and the Qing government's failure to modernize its military left the country vulnerable to foreign invasion. Beyond the battlefield, corruption and bureaucratic inefficiency plagued the Qing government. Local officials, more interested in lining their own pockets than defending the nation, allowed opium smuggling to flourish despite official bans. This corruption eroded the authority of the state, making it difficult for the central government to enforce its policies or protect its people. The bureaucratic rot that had set in during the later years of the dynasty only deepened as the empire struggled to deal with the twin threats of internal rebellion and foreign invasion. As the historian John King Fairbank observed, the Qing was forced to make humiliating concessions, and its inability to defend the country made it clear that reform was desperately needed. These humiliations came in the form of the unequal treaties that followed both Opium Wars. The Qing government was forced to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open additional treaty ports to foreign merchants, and legalise the opium trade, all of which undermined China's sovereignty. To the Chinese people, these concessions were more than just diplomatic defeats. They were symbols of national humiliation, proof that the once great empire was crumbling under foreign pressure. The Qing government's failure to protect China from these humiliations shattered its legitimacy in the eyes of many Chinese. Intellectuals, reformers, and even some government officials began to call for sweeping changes to the country's military, political, and economic systems. The Opium Wars had laid bare the flaws in the Qing system, and it was clear that if China was to survive, it needed to modernize. These calls for reform would later give rise to movements like the self-strengthening movement, which sought to adopt Western technology and practices to strengthen China against future threats. However, these reform efforts came too late to save the Qing dynasty. The internal unrest sparked by the opium trade, combined with the continued pressure from foreign powers, would eventually lead to the dynasty's downfall in the early 20th century. The Opium Wars, which began as a conflict over trade, had set in motion a series of events that would reshape China's future. The country was left weakened, humiliated, and on the path to revolution. As China grappled with the immediate and long-term consequences of the Opium Wars, the legacy of these conflicts would continue to shape its society, politics, and international relations for decades to come. But the damage wasn't just confined to China's borders. The Opium Wars had ripple effects that would resonate across the world, altering the balance of power in Asia and beyond. The Opium Wars cast a long shadow over China, ushering in what would later be known as the Century of Humiliation. This period, which stretched from the First Opium War in 1839 to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, was marked by repeated foreign invasions, unequal treaties, internal rebellions, and a steady erosion of Chinese sovereignty. The wars were the opening act in a drama that saw China brought to its knees, forced to contend with the overwhelming military and economic power of Western imperialism. The Opium Wars, particularly the first, were the start of China's humiliating encounters with foreign powers, where it was coerced into treaties that stripped the empire of its autonomy. The treaties following both the First and Second Opium Wars were stark reminders of China's inability to resist the military might of Britain and its allies. These unequal treaties set the tone for the next 100 years of Chinese history, as foreign nations carved out economic and political privileges at the expense of China's sovereignty. As historian Jonathan D. Spence remarked, the Opium Wars opened the floodgates to Western imperialism, and China would spend the next century grappling with foreign powers and internal rebellion. The treaties that resulted from these conflicts, beginning with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, forced China to cede territory, open additional ports to foreign trade, and pay enormous indemnities. Most notably, the Treaty of Nanking handed over the island of Hong Kong to Britain and opened 5 treaty ports, including Shanghai and Canton, to unrestricted foreign trade. The treaty also introduced extraterritoriality, which allowed British citizens to operate outside Chinese law, further undermining the Qing dynasty's control over its own land. Subsequent treaties following the Second Opium War only worsened the situation. The Treaty of Tianjin, 1858, and the Convention of Peking, 1860, opened even more ports, legalized the opium trade, and permitted foreign missionaries to travel freely throughout China. These concessions eroded Chinese sovereignty, granting foreign powers control over key parts of the country and embedding foreign influence deep into Chinese society. These treaties not only humiliated China, but also exposed the Qing government's impotence, signalling to the world that China was vulnerable to exploitation. As China's autonomy crumbled, foreign powers took advantage, carving out spheres of influence across the nation. Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan all sought to claim pieces of China's vast territory for their own economic and political gain. Coastal cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Hong Kong became strongholds of foreign control, while other regions, such as Manchuria and Shandong, were heavily influenced by Russian and German interests, respectively. China was effectively divided, its resources exploited, and its people subjected to foreign domination. Western nations built railways, established mines, and extracted vast quantities of China's raw materials, further weakening the empire's control over its economy. This foreign exploitation deepened China's economic dependency and exacerbated social inequality. Wealth flowed out of the country and into foreign hands, increasingly marginalised. The Chinese economy, once the envy of the world, was now being carved up by foreign interests, leaving the population impoverished and disillusioned. The legalisation of the opium trade, in particular, had devastating effects on Chinese society. The continued influx of the drug deepened the addiction crisis that had begun in the 19th century, with millions of Chinese lives destroyed by opium. As silver reserves continued to drain from the country, China's financial stability crumbled. As foreign powers exerted greater control over Chinese society, a wave of anti-foreign sentiment began to grow. The repeated humiliations at the hands of Western nations, combined with the Qing government's inability to resist these incursions, fueled a rising tide of nationalism. Chinese intellectuals and reformers, disillusioned by the government's failure to protect the country, began to advocate for radical change. They sought to reclaim China's dignity, calling for a return to Chinese sovereignty and the expulsion of foreign influence. This movement laid the groundwork for the revolutionary fervour that would later sweep across China. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, revolutionary movements began to gain momentum. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, which erupted during the aftermath of the First Opium War, was one of the first major uprisings in response to the Qing government's failures. The rebellion, led by a Christian convert who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sought to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a new, divinely inspired kingdom. Although the Taiping Rebellion was ultimately crushed, it reflected the deep dissatisfaction many Chinese felt with their government. Later, the Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, would emerge as another expression of anti-foreign and anti-Christian sentiment. The Boxers, a secret society that sought to rid China of foreign influence, launched attacks against foreign missionaries and Chinese Christians, blaming them for the country's suffering. The rebellion was violently suppressed by a coalition of Western powers, but it further highlighted the growing divide between the Chinese people and their government. Ultimately, these movements contributed to the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 and the establishment of the Republic of China. The opening of China to foreign trade, missionary activity, and political influence in the wake of the Opium Wars fundamentally altered the country's landscape. The treaty ports, initially established as points of entry for foreign merchants, soon became hubs of foreign control. Cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou were transformed into international trading centres, with entire sections of these cities governed by foreign laws and customs. These concessions became enclaves of Western power, where Chinese sovereignty was effectively nullified. Foreign merchants dominated key industries, from shipping to textiles, while Chinese entrepreneurs were sidelined. The treaty ports became centres of economic inequality as Western companies and individuals reaped the benefits of China's resources, while the local population struggled under the weight of foreign exploitation. This dynamic deepened China's dependence on foreign powers, further entrenching the economic imbalances that had begun with the opium trade. The influx presence of foreign missionaries was often seen as an insult to Chinese traditions and values, further stoking the fires of nationalism. Even as missionaries offered aid, they were often caught in the crossfire of China's larger struggle against foreign control. In addition to trade and religion, the Opium Wars opened China to Western political and social ideas. Chinese reformers, exposed to Western knowledge and technology, began to advocate for the modernization of China's military, economy, and government. This led to the self-strengthening movement, 1861 to 1895, which sought to adopt Western industrial and military techniques while preserving Confucian values. However, the movement's limited success revealed the deep structural problems within the Qing government, which was unable to fully embrace the changes needed to compete with Western powers. The rise of Chinese nationalism during this period also had profound long-term effects. Figures like Sun Yat-sen, who would go on to lead the revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty, were heavily influenced by both Western political ideals and a desire to restore China's independence. The nationalist movement, which gained momentum in the early 20th century, sought to rid China of foreign influence and establish a modern republic. The Opium Wars and the subsequent foreign domination of China had set the stage for the revolutionary upheavals that would eventually reshape the country. For Britain, the long-term effects of the Opium Wars were far more positive. The wars secured Britain's economic dominance in China, particularly through the legalization of the opium trade. British merchants reaped immense profits from the continued sale of opium, helping to finance the empire's colonial expansion across Asia. The opening of additional treaty ports allowed British companies to establish vast trading networks, exporting British goods to China while importing valuable Chinese commodities like tea and silk. Shanghai in particular grew into one of the most important international ports in the world, with British merchants controlling much of the commerce flowing through the city. Britain's victory in the Opium Wars also cemented its position as a dominant imperial power in East Asia. The acquisition of Hong Kong provided a critical base for British naval operations in the Pacific, further solidifying Britain's influence in the region. However, even as Britain basked in the economic and political gains of its victories, there were those at home who questioned the morality of the empire's involvement in the opium trade. The ethical debate over the trade continued to simmer in Britain, with religious leaders, political figures, and social reformers criticising the empire's role in spreading addiction and exploiting China. While the economic benefits were clear, the costs, both moral and human, were harder to justify. As Britain's imperial reach expanded, so too did the administrative challenges of maintaining control over its growing territories. The costs of empire, from maintaining naval superiority to managing colonies like Hong Kong, placed increasing burdens on Britain's resources. Despite these challenges, the Opium Wars had cemented Britain's status as the world's leading imperial power. But while Britain's empire flourished, the legacy of the Opium Wars continued to haunt China. The wars had set in motion a century of decline, foreign domination, and internal upheaval. Even after the wars ended, the opium Instead, it continued to expand in scope and influence, shaping China's society and economy in increasingly devastating ways. After the Second Opium War and the signing of the Treaty of Tianjin in 1858, the trade was legalized, removing any pretense of diplomacy. With this legalization came a dramatic increase in the volume of opium flooding into China. British merchants, under the control of the East India Company, ramped up production in India's opium-growing regions of Bengal and Malwa, driving the expansion of the trade to meet the skyrocketing demand in China. The consequences for Chinese society were catastrophic. By the 1870s, it was estimated that tens of millions of Chinese citizens were addicted to opium, with the drug's influence seeping into every layer of society. From labourers and peasants to government officials, addiction weakened the very fabric of Chinese life. The poorest communities were hit the hardest, with entire families devastated by the grip of addiction. Workforces became unproductive, rural economies struggled to survive, and the social order began to unravel. Opium dens became ubiquitous in major cities like Canton and Shanghai, where addicts gathered in smoky rooms, lost in the haze of the drug. Despite treaties meant to regulate the trade, the Qing government made sporadic attempts to curb the domestic distribution of opium. Local officials, often corrupted by the lucrative profits involved, occasionally tried to restrict its sale. But these efforts were undermined at every turn. The demand for the drug, coupled with the widespread corruption that allowed the trade to flourish, meant that meaningful resistance was rare. The government's inability to control the opium trade reflected its broader weakness in managing foreign influence, setting the stage for internal rebellion and growing resentment toward the Qing regime. The British, meanwhile, dominated the opium trade throughout the late 19th century. British merchants controlled the flow of opium from India to China, where the drug continued to generate enormous profits. These profits fueled not only British wealth, but also the administration of their colonial empire, particularly in India. British colonial officials in India oversaw the cultivation and export of opium, ensuring the empire's dominance in the trade. Though Britain controlled the supply, Chinese middlemen played a significant role in distributing the drug throughout the country. Many local merchants became rich, embedding opium further into the economic structure of Chinese society and making it nearly impossible to eradicate. As the 19th century wore on, resistance to the opium trade grew within China. Reformers and officials began to speak out against the destruction the drug had wrought. By the late 1800s, the calls for reform had become louder as intellectuals, Confucian scholars, and grassroots movements rallied against the opium crisis. They viewed the opium epidemic not just as a public health disaster, but as a moral and social failure, a symbol of China's fall from power and prestige. Reformers pushed for a broader program of modernization that would include not only political and military reforms, but also a serious effort to combat opium addiction and restore the nation's dignity. Outside of China, voices in Britain also began to shift. By the end of the 19th century, British public opinion was increasingly turning against against the opium trade. Religious groups and moral reformers, led by organisations like the Society for the Suppression of the Opium Trade, launched campaigns that brought the devastating effects of opium to the forefront of British consciousness. Missionaries who had witnessed the destruction in China returned home to lobby for change, reporting on the widespread suffering caused by the drug. These moral campaigns gained traction, leading to debates within Parliament and calls for Britain to end its involvement in the opium trade. Lord Palmerston, a key figure in British politics, famously condemned the trade, stating, "It is not only immoral, but economically short-sighted to sustain a trade that poisons both our customers and our reputation." As Britain sought to maintain its influence in China, the recognition grew that continuing the opium trade would damage long-term relations and undermine British interests. The mounting pressure from moral campaigns, combined with economic concerns about anti-British sentiment in China, slowly began to erode the support for the opium trade within British policy circles. The push to end the opium trade was not just a domestic matter for Britain, it became a global issue. In the early 20th century, the international community began to recognise the dangers of unchecked opium production and distribution. The first International Opium Convention, held in The Hague in 1912, marked a significant step toward curbing the trade. Major powers, including Britain, agreed to impose restrictions on opium production and sales, a move that reflected the growing awareness of the drug's destructive impact. China, by this time, actively working to reform and modernise, played a key role in these global efforts to suppress the opium trade. For Britain, the end of its official involvement in the opium trade came gradually, particularly as India moved toward independence. By the early 20th century, the British government had significantly reduced its role in the opium trade, and following India's independence in 1947, the trade was formally abolished in the region. While illegal smuggling continued for some time, the British Empire's days of profiting from the opium trade were over. The global efforts to suppress the drug trade, led by both international organisations and domestic reformers, were largely successful in reducing opium's reach. By the early 20th century, opium consumption in China had begun to decline. Government crackdowns, public health campaigns, and the rising awareness of the drug's harmful effects led to a significant reduction in addiction rates. The Chinese population, once gripped by widespread dependency, began to move away from the drug as new alternatives for trade and revenue were explored. As global economic patterns shifted, opium became less central to Britain's imperial economy. Other industries, particularly those in manufacturing and finance, took precedence, and Britain's reliance on the opium trade diminished. China officially banned the opium trade in the early 20th century, and by the 1930s, international efforts to curb the drug trade had largely succeeded. Yet, the legacy of the opium trade left deep scars on China's society, economy, and international relations. The damage caused by decades of addiction and exploitation persisted long after the trade had ended. The social and economic strain created by the opium trade contributed to China's vulnerability vulnerability to foreign influence and its internal struggles throughout the early 20th century. The opium trade set the stage for China's eventual revolution and the rise of the People's Republic of China in 1949. As China sought to rebuild and reclaim its sovereignty, the lessons of the opium era loomed large. The addiction crisis, the unequal treaties, and the foreign domination that had defined China's century of humiliation left a lasting imprint on the nation's identity. And while the opium trade eventually faded into history, its effects would continue to resonate in China's quest for autonomy and strength. As I reflect on the tumultuous events of the Opium Wars, it's clear that these conflicts were more than just battles over trade. They were pivotal moments that reshaped China's history and left a lasting mark on its identity. The First Opium War, which began in 1839, was sparked by trade disputes over opium and silver. Britain, frustrated by the trade imbalance, resorted to using opium as leverage, flooding the Chinese market with the drug. When the Qing government tried to resist, Britain responded with force, leading to China's defeat. The result was the Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, which not only ceded Hong Kong to Britain, but also opened 5 key ports to foreign trade. This marked the beginning of what is often referred to as China's century of humiliation. It was the first major crack in China's sovereignty, and the consequences would echo for generations. The Second Opium War, beginning in 1856, saw both Britain and France press their demands even further. Triggered by the Arrow incident, this conflict quickly escalated into full-scale war, with the Anglo-French forces capturing Beijing in 1860 and, in a devastating act of retaliation, burning the magnificent old summer palace to the ground. The treaties that followed, the Treaty of Tianjin and the Convention of Peking, opened even more ports to foreign powers, legalized the opium trade, and forced China to cede additional territory. With each treaty, China's sovereignty eroded further, and the Qing dynasty's grip on power weakened. These wars laid bare the extent of China's vulnerability to foreign aggression, sowing the seeds for the internal rebellions and unrest that would follow. The legacy of the Opium Wars is a complex and painful one. Politically, the wars signalled the beginning of China's decline as a great power. The Qing dynasty, already weakened from within, faced mounting pressures from both foreign powers and internal rebellions, like the devastating Taiping Rebellion. The wars also exposed the Qing government's inability to modernize or reform in the face of new global realities. Socially, the wars left deep scars. Opium addiction ravaged the population, and the humiliation of defeat haunted the national psyche. It wasn't until the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, and eventually the rise of the Communist Party in 1949, that China began to fully regain its footing. On the international stage, the Opium Wars fundamentally reshaped China's relationships with Western powers and Japan. The framework of unequal treaties established during these conflicts persisted well into the 20th century, reinforcing setting the stage for the eventual push towards self-determination in the 20th century. As we bring this journey through history to a close, I want to thank you for joining me. I hope you found this exploration of the Opium Wars both informative and calming. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe,